This episode is about India's fastest growing city. It is also called the Silicon Valley of India, Bengaluru. So around 6 महीने पहले मैं बैंगलोर में था and I absolutely loved the city. But soon after, this happened.
And if Africa is battling a drought, India's tech capital is drowning in flood. We're talking about Bengaluru, the Silicon Valley of India. It has been hit by record rains.
These new structures not only impacted water infiltration into the soil, but essentially began obstructing the movement of water into these valleys.
So Bengaluru floods really made me think and even made me more intrigued कि climate change है क्या? So this is why we interviewed Dr. Indu Murthy to understand this issue further. She's a climate change scientist and she has worked extensively in the fields of environmental studies, climate adaptability, and climate mitigation. Also, if you like this episode, do check out the previous episodes on Spotify on the link below. Hello, welcome back to another episode on this climate change series. And I have Dr. Indu with me here. Well, ma'am, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate you being here.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and let's dive right into the topic today. So let's talk about like your journey as a research scientist. So what have your areas of key research been, and like what really inspired you to work in climate change?
Okay. So, frankly speaking, I didn't actually start my journey working on climate change because I actually started my scientific research journey in the 90s, 94, 95. So climate change was not really perceived as a big problem at that point in time. But yes, there were some conversations going around. So I was trained and I had specialized in forestry and environment. So given that, I started my journey looking at community forestry and what was called as joint forest management at that point in time, where communities and the forest departments were together looking at how best you can manage and conserve forests. So that is where my journey started. But along the way, climate change became a larger issue, and then the team that I worked with started looking at the professor that I worked with started digging deeper into the issues of climate change, particularly in the natural resource sectors, and that's how I started my journey around climate change. And all along, it's been looking at how does climate impact resources. And then in turn, the lives and livelihoods of forest-dependent communities. So that's something that I've kind of looked at for quite some time over the years. But then moving on, I also kind of dipped my feet into the market mechanisms in climate, which is to do with the clean development mechanism. So I kind of helped develop 3 different projects, forestry projects. And one of them was actually registered with the UN. And which kind of introduced me into the complex methodological issues when carbon trading in the forest sector actually begins. So that I think was the turning point. So after which I continued work on the climate and forest or natural resource interface, and haven't looked back after that. So and I am where I am today now.
That's awesome. Was there a key insight that sort of made that shift for you?
No, there wasn't a key insight, but like I said, what really kind of struck me when I started working on climate change is that it wasn't an independent research issue, but it was something that was cutting across all the various sectors and interest areas that I was looking at, or even others were looking at. So it kind of, I would think of it as another lens that was added to the problems that I was trying to look into. And if we ignored that lens, I also realized that, it could actually skew the entire problem or the resource and the management itself. So that I would think was practically the reason as to why I continue to look at climate change and the intersections of it with people, with resource management policies, and so on and so forth.
Wow. That's really interesting. Like how you're saying, like it sounds like a more wholesome problem, right? Because there's a lot of aspects to it. And
Right.
that's how I honestly thought it was a scientist's issue, right? This is not something like
Mm.
people like us, youngsters, people in marketing would really care about. So I read this book from Bill Gates, and
Mhm.
it said how to avoid a climate disaster. And
Right.
that sort of made me like really think that it's not just, it's not just a scientist's issue. It really boils down to every person in the society. So that's really interesting to get your perspective as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the food we eat, to the water we drink, to the air we
Yeah,
breathe, right?
yeah.
Basic essentials of life.
Hmm.
Everything is going to be impacted by climate. So you really need to be cognizant of it,
Hmm.
make those changes that need to be done, be it in the management, be it in the policy space, be it in the behavior, our own use, right? The way we
Yeah.
kind of consume goods or dispose goods. So I think that's where it is a cross-cutting issue.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Bangalore. So, like, you've been living in the city. So, how do you feel like the city has changed, like, in terms of infrastructure and like our preparedness with climate disasters?
Yeah, like any other city in the world, I think Bangalore has also kind of grown
Yeah.
quite fast, I would say. And then, of course, it's been burgeoning at the edges, at the seams, because there's a lot of peri-urban spaces, which to me, I, of course, started living in Bangalore about 25, 28 years ago, although I belong to the state.
Hmm.
But for me, it's like, certain areas of Bangalore, which were like outskirts of Bangalore, are now seem to be in the heart of Bangalore. So I would think, it's kind of developed enormously in a good way to some extent, but then it's also kind of eaten up a lot of things along the way, which we will of course talk about as we
Yeah.
go along. So development, yes, but related to that, it's also about how infrastructure has developed to support the more population that's coming
Hmm.
into the city, and also the kind of transport networks that need to be there. So I think all of these have grown multifold as
Yeah.
compared to what it was, say, 20 years back.
Yeah. But do you think like it aligns with the preparedness for climate disasters? Like, considering,
Unfortunately, no. The
like,
problem.
is that a big no or like a slight no?
Uh, I would think, the thinking is there.
Hmm.
See, we don't have dearth of well-meaning policies and programs in India in general. And I would think, even at the city level, yes, there are certain things that are already being discussed. But then when it actually comes to implementation, there's a gap. And that
Hmm.
gap continues to remain over many decades. So to some extent, yes, there is some level of preparedness when it comes to climate information dissemination and providing the information. Yes, there has been a lot of evolution, lot of development with respect to what science can tell you in advance. But however, it has to be translated into a form which would allow people to take decisions. Now, I think that's where the gap. It's a communication problem, right? In a way,
Hmm.
would think, yes, there is science, there is some information, but then how is it communicated? Who does it reach? And when does it reach people? Does it allow enough time for people to make those decisions and choices? So that's the kind of issues that we are dealing with today. So partly we are prepared, but then we are really not completely prepared to address the problem, to buffer or do away with large scale damages or losses.
Oh, that's a very interesting point. So, like, what you would say, the science is there, but
Yeah.
the communication hasn't really trickled down to the population. Hmm.
Yes, it does reach a few pockets, but it really doesn't go to every single person or the most vulnerable populations, which are usually in the low-lying areas in a city like Bangalore, maybe the slum dwellers. They are the ones who are worst affected in
Hmm.
general.
Hmm.
So, are we able to kind of give that information to them or give them alternate plans as to, okay, move from here to elsewhere, uh, like they do in maybe a large state like Kerala, which kind or Odisha, over the years, their disaster management, the package that comes with it is kind of evolved enormously. So they've kind of, they moved to a place where it's not disaster management anymore, it's disaster preparedness. But
Hmm.
traditionally, it's been management all along. So we really need to kind of switch to preparedness, given that science is kind of evolving and there's information that is becoming available, which helps decision making.
Wow, that's really interesting. Let's let's talk about the Bangalore floods, like that happened recently. So I have two questions. Like, what exactly led up to this? I'm asking this because again, like I loved Bangalore. I was there like around 6, 7 months back for a week, and I absolutely loved the city, even though being a Delhiite. And honestly, I was shocked to see that such a amazing city with so many smart people. There was flooding. So that's one question. Second is like, do you think this was uh after effect of climate change, or was it a man-made disaster?
I would think it's both.
Mm-hmm.
So, although you cannot completely delineate it and say that, yes, it's because of climate change, but at the same time, yes, it is definitely a trigger. But then what exacerbated the problem of flooding or the heavy rainfall that occurred is the way the city has developed. So I would think it's a combination of the two that has led to what became a quite massive flooding at scale in certain parts of Bangalore. Now, why I say this, it's a climate change problem, is that there has been enough climate evidence and modeling that's happened at the global level, at the regional, or even at India, and even for the state of Karnataka, which CSTEP itself has conducted some climate modeling projections and downscaled and looked at what's likely to happen in the next 30 years, for instance, right? So what we very clearly see is a wetter future and a warmer future. Now, the wetter future may sound like good news in certain areas where there is low rainfall, but however, that said, I think when it comes to rainfall, the trick here is how is it distributed? That's what would make it a good news or a bad news. Now, what we are also seeing in these the climate projections work that we did, and much of the global models also talk about this, is increase in extreme events. Now, when I say extreme events, you're probably looking at more and more heavy rainfall events, maybe 100 mm rainfall in a day, increasingly happening as compared to what happened in the past. So if there were 3 days in the past over a year that received 100 mm rainfall in a day, what you would see in the future is maybe 6 days in certain areas or 10 days in certain areas. And also, we do not know if these 3 days or 6 days are going to be at different points in time, or they're going to be continuously for 3 days, right? Now, that's where the patterns of rainfall, the patterns of intensity, the magnitude, the frequency, both of it are changing, which is why I would say that it is a climate change problem. And the heavy rainfall that happened consistently over several days is what led to the flooding. But then the flooding, of course, may not have happened if there was enough drainage systems that were there, or if constructions had not happened on the natural aquifers that are there. So there's some unscrupulous development that's really kind of happened, which is why I would say it's a man-made problem which exacerbated the climate change problem.
What's the average rainfall that this southern Bangalore region is supposed to get?
It differs. It differs across various districts of Karnataka. I don't remember.
Like you mentioned, 100 mm, right? So is that a lot?
No, 100 mm in a day is way too much for any particular city, for that matter. Even if it's a very high rainfall region, I would think, if a lot of rainfall happens in one go, then it's actually bad.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's there.
Yeah.
So which is why, even though a region might be used to receiving high amounts of rainfall, but if it's distributed over a period of time, then it's really fine. But if it just happens all in one go, then it's bad news. Roughly, I would think the average rainfall in Bangalore is less than 1,000 mm, average annual rainfall, right? So now that is distributed over 4 months or 6 months, or June, July, August, September, which is the prime monsoon season,
Yeah.
right? It spreads over those weeks, even plus or minus another 1 or 2 weeks this way, that way. But instead, you have, say, 150 mm of rainfall happening within 3 days out of that 950 or 970. That's obviously not great news, which is what would lead to extreme levels of waterlogging, flooding, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense because I'm not sure how much rainfall we're supposed to get. But yeah, I think if you're getting that 150 mm within a few days, I'm sure that would be a lot.
Yes. Yeah, possibly, yes.
Going a little more granular into the issue, like so it said like in 16th century Bangalore had like around 1,000 lakes, and now at this point it's just has 210. So like, do you think this altered topography has also affected the climate situation?
Absolutely. Yes. I think wetlands are extremely important. They have their own ecosystem they create.
Could you also like explain it in a way that like a more general audience can also get, like, how has it really affected this entire region?
Right. See, when we talk about wetlands, they are natural water holding bodies within, lakes, for instance. So lakes are also kind of wetlands, inland wetlands, as they call them. Now, when you have these lakes, there is a place for water to actually kind of come and accumulate over time, right? Now, when these are completely kind of, let's say, they fill it up with soil, and then there's a construction that comes up. The natural aquifers are already there. And when I say aquifers, it's not man-made drainage. It's under the ground. Naturally, every place has a certain slope, certain way the water drains, right? Now, these are the natural aquifers. Now, when you actually shut down, it's like, you have a pipe, it has multiple ways of going out, but you clog one, right? You completely block one, then the water has to find its way somewhere. Or if it finds a weak spot in the particular pipe that which it usually flows through, then it'll kind of seep through it, or it'll break it open, right? That's what water can do. So given that wetlands are natural water holding bodies, the minute you kind of have constructions over it, you completely close it down. In a normal, fairly sparse rainfall, when it happens, it really doesn't make so much of a difference because the soil would seep it. It'll kind of take it in. But then when you have excess of water that's out there, the soil has a certain capacity to seep in water. But then what is left has to flow somewhere. And that's what happens when you have development over these spaces, or you have wetlands that are complete because of soil erosion. It's all clogged. There's so much of soil that the water holding capacity of the water bodies goes down, which is when, rejuvenation of lakes, conservation of lakes, all of these become extremely important too.
Yeah, and like this scenario that happened, like we went from 1,000 lakes to 210 lakes. Is it like completely responsible? Like, I know in some regions of India, like these lakes sort of dried up, but is this just because of encroachment, or were there any other reasons around it?
As far as my knowledge goes, I personally myself do not work on wetlands, so I'm not an expert on that. My general knowledge tells me that while some of them were natural drying up, but a lot of it was for developmental reasons. So, see, there's a very fine balance between environment, economics, and development at the end of the day. Yes, maybe they had to do what they had to do, but the problem is, was it really needed? Were there even alternate options? So that is something we do not know as to why it happened at a certain point in time.
Yeah, and like I think we already talked about the patterns of rainfall in southern India, but like going more granular, like you mentioned that the rainfall is supposed to be 1,000 mm throughout the year. But do you see the same pattern in all of southern India, or is it just like this particular region?
No, I would think, it's not just Karnataka. Generally, if you look at any state of India for that matter, what we see, any state for that matter, any state of India, because we've done an analysis at a district level, we've downscaled the climate information. And historical information has been analyzed based on station data that's available from the Indian Meteorological Department, IMD. So when you look at that, we see that rainfall patterns, quantum of rainfall has changed. When I say historical, we're looking at the recent past, which is 1991 to 2019 period. That's a 30-year window. So there you see that any district of India that you consider, by and large, right? By and large, there could be some outliers, but by and large, in a majority of the districts of India, what we see is that there is a warming in the summer maximum temperature, which is your March, April, May. Also in the winter minimum temperature, which is your December, January, February temperatures. And the monsoon season rainfall has also increased overall. The variability has also changed. When I say variability, it's about the distribution, which is the cause of the problem also. Now, that's the historical period. And then what we do next is using climate models, which we downscale and to a district level, what we project climate into the future also. When I say climate, again, the same parameters of summer maximum temperature, winter minimum temperature, and monsoon season rainfall. And what we do see for the next 30 years, which is 2021 to 2050, because whenever you talk about climate change, it has to be a minimum 30-year window. Although ideally a 50-year window is what is suggested. The reason we picked up the 30-year window is because where we wanted to kind of create awareness about the climate problem itself at all stakeholders, with all stakeholders. We wanted to sensitize people to the problem, which is, unless you acknowledge that, yes, there is an issue, people will not kind of try to integrate the climate information into the planning process. And given that 30-year window is something that most people can relate to, it's during our own lifetimes, right? So, which is why we picked up the 30-year window. And what we see in this 2030s, as we call it, that is 2021 to 2050, is that compared to the historical period of the previous 30 years, there is going to be warming, which means there's going to be increase in temperatures, both in the summer maximum temperature as well as the winter minimum temperature. So now the scale is varied across the various districts. It could be anywhere between 0.2 or 0.1 degree to as high as 3.5 degrees, right? So that is the level of warming that might happen over various parts of India. And the rainfall also is projected to increase in most parts of India, most districts of India. Now, apart from this, again, we also looked at the heavy rainfall events, because wetter future also means that there are likely to be more heavy rainfall events. So we look at how many days in the future as compared to the previous historical 30 years would receive, say, 51 to 100 mm rainfall within a day. Or greater than 100 mm rainfall within a day. Now, why we chose 51 to 100 mm is because, in certain districts, the overall rainfall itself is so small. I can't say that in a northern Karnataka district, which is pretty arid, or in Rajasthan, if I try to analyze whether districts are going to be receiving greater than 100 mm rainfall, probably I would see zero, because, they don't happen there at all. The overall rainfall itself wouldn't reach a certain level in certain districts. So which is why we look at even the slightly lower, magnitude of rainfall. And what we do see starkly that in a majority of the districts of India, be it southern India, northeastern India, northern, western, or central India, you will see an increase in these heavy rainfall events, which also kind of boils down to the fact that since you have a heavy rainfall event, you're also looking at probably increasing dry spells also. So it's a compounded risk that we are getting ourselves into. Because traditionally some parts were facing only droughts. But then moving forward, it's likely that they will face flooding at a certain time of the year and drought in certain other times of the year. Now, Karnataka has witnessed that. Northern part of Karnataka, a few years back, did witness heavy rainfall during the monsoon season. And then a few months later, during summer, they had drought. That was something that they saw within a single year. And they also had hailstones, which was unheard of. And so
Wow.
these are the kind of changes that we are witnessing because of climate change. Now,
Mm-hmm.
interestingly, another important thing which is related to why we need to integrate the climate information in the planning process comes to the fact that some of the districts which historically had no such heavy rainfall event in the past 30 years may have these events. So it was zero in the past. So moving forward, they are likely to have these, which means to say the infrastructure is not ready. It cannot cope with that level of
Mm-hmm.
change, which is why you need to kind of start preparing yourself by integrating climate information and then try and see how do you buffer the damages. You may not be able to completely do away with it, but to a large extent, you can buffer it, which is what Odisha state very clearly demonstrated after the large cyclone that happened, Amphan, and then they said, okay, we need to do something about it. And they went into a preparedness mode. And the amount of damage that happened, that they recorded, the loss in lives declined quite drastically, very significantly.
Wow. So you're saying like we are not at the stage to do away the damage, we're the stage
Yeah.
just to buffer it.
Absolutely. I mean,
And
doing away the damage would require, let me also put it this way, yes, the science has improved a lot, but then we cannot still have very precise information for a specific location. Specifically, maybe temperature to a large extent, we can still kind of predict. But then rainfall, I think it's a very dynamic process. And I think the Asian monsoon is one of the very complex systems to actually model. Now, given that models, of course, it's a set of equations that run these models. There
yeah.
are a whole lot of assumptions that go in. So maybe some of the models do overestimate or underestimate to a large extent. We still cannot say that in this 30 by 30 kilometer range, this is the change, this is the amount of rainfall that's likely to happen. Very soon we might get there, but as of today, we still do not have that precise an information to say that, okay, this particular taluk in this particular district is likely to receive so much of rainfall in the next 30 hours or 50 hours or 80 hours. So please do what needs to be done. So which is why I would think that if you kind of prepare yourself for some extreme levels, then you are actually buffering the damage to a limited extent, but still it's not as bad as it would be if you didn't know something was going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a very, very interesting point. Like at the stage we are, and I just had a one like follow-up question to that. So you're saying in
Yeah.
the next 30 years we're going to see such extreme events. So when do you think
Hmm.
like is going to be an approximate peak when we're going to
Hmm.
see this happening more often? Like right now we are
See,
seeing it, but when
yeah.
do we hit that peak?
Right. I mean, it's hard to pinpoint again as to when it is likely to happen,
Yeah, yeah,
because it's a 30-year average. Now, if I
yeah.
say 6 events, it can happen next year or it could happen. But what people do, climate scientists also talk about is the return period of these extreme events, right?
Hmm.
When they say return period, see, a 1 in 100 year flooding event of a certain magnitude may happen once in 30 years. From 100, it's come down to 30. So which means to say, you need to be much more prepared. So
Hmm.
that's the level of understanding which definitely exists, which can help in the planning process.
Yeah. Could you let's switch gears a bit. Could you explain like the difference between planned and unplanned urbanization?
So when we say
Like,
planned
yes.
urbanization, yes, did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, just I was just wondering like this difference in context with climate change. How does
Mm-hmm,
it go
mm-hmm.
hand in hand?
Yeah. So, I mean, when you talk about urbanization in a planned manner, it's about, uh, see, people need to be visionaries to have that kind of a plan, frankly speaking, because,
Hmm.
you need to be able to foresee that uh, certain cities are going to have a larger population over a period of time. There are infrastructure requirements that need to be there, which boils down to having the road networks, the rail networks in cities that actually exist. or even looking at housing and other issues. Now, I would think, that is the way one needs to look at a planned urbanization. But
Hmm.
however, you need to be looking at, say, the next 30 years or 20 years, short term, medium term, long term. Planning is something that planners do kind of look into. That would be very, very important if you have to have a planned urbanization. But we also know for a fact that a lot of the urbanization is kind of, it's definitely unplanned. There is an exodus, not really an exodus, but then you have
Hmm.
people moving in for, it's aspirational when it is rural to urban. But it's
Yeah.
also urban to urban many a time, because people are, looking out for jobs the way, because certain sectors have developed so much. For example, in Bangalore, the IT sector. So you have people from all across India who come and live here. So which means, it's the way the economy is actually developing, which is leading to the way the city is booming. So given
Hmm.
that, I don't have a ready answer as to, how do you plan for this kind of urbanization. One thing that definitely comes to my mind, which seems quite textbookish in a way, but people are kind of talking about it, is, carrying capacity. How do you define the carrying capacity of a system, right? So if you
Hmm.
have so many square meters of area which has these resources, what is the population that it can support? Can we
Hmm.
define, can we stick to that? Can we have hard rules as to it cannot overshoot
Yeah, yeah.
this?
I think
Which
Bangalore
means
has overshot its
it's
carrying
definitely
capacity.
overshot, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
you need to have clean water, clean energy, everything needs to be there, housing. So
Hmm.
people are kind of exploring this idea of carrying capacity estimations. How do we define
Hmm.
carrying capacity of systems? It could be a city, it could be a nature reserve, it could be some other pocket, the sensitive, eco-sensitive areas. And then, kind of come up with ways of saying that, okay, this is all we can take. We shouldn't
Hmm.
be overshooting it. So I think we still yet to get there. But I think there is a lot of thinking that's going into that. I think
Yeah.
the very recent episode of the Joshimat is also bringing to fore
Hmm.
this very problem,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Because I saw some weird number, something that was outlandish for me, but maybe it is the truth that, the number of tourists who actually visit that region is so much more than the people who actually live there.
Wow.
So that kind of numbers is what I saw. I don't know how much of it is the truth, but
Hmm.
all it kind of comes down to is, the carrying capacity ultimately.
Hmm.
Can it actually take in so many people in a given time?
Yeah.
So these are the questions which needs to be looked into.
Hmm.
When trying to contextualize it with climate change, as I said, see, climate change, the direct impacts as we see it is about sea level rise, it's about rainfall increase, it's about temperature increase or a drought. But then there are second order, third order impacts that kind of come in, which is to do with impact on food production, impact on health, because pests and diseases could increase because of more
Hmm.
moisture, because we are talking of a better future.
So
Vector-borne diseases could increase. So,
sorry to
which means health infrastructure.
yeah, sorry to cut you off, but this sounds really
Yeah,
interesting. The first order, second order, and third order. Could you actually
right.
explain them? Um,
Okay. So
yeah.
when we talk about when you say how does climate change manifest itself, because of climate change, we say, okay, there is rainfall pattern change or increase in the rainfall, or you say temperature changes. Sea level rise is another thing that we talk about.
Hmm.
Then because of increased temperatures, there is glacial melt, which becomes a second order impact, right? It is not
Oh, okay.
direct. How does the glaciers melt? Because there is increased temperature.
Hmm.
That's what it leads to. Now, because of increased temperature, again, there could be impact on food production because crops are very sensitive to certain temperatures, availability of soil, water, moisture, and so on and so forth. Now, these are second order impacts. Now, the third order impact, if I want to get into the food cycle itself, is that when food production is impacted,
Hmm.
then the food that comes into the market gets reduced. So there are economy wide impacts because the food prices go up. Import, export, these things also might get impacted. But if you're looking at a local level, let's say from a nutritional perspective also. Particularly in India, we have a large population of small and marginal landholders. Now, what they do is they keep very little for themselves and they sell most of it because they need to kind of run their homes. Now, when the production itself goes down, what happens is that what is left for consumption reduces. So there's malnutrition that could also happen. So that's like the fourth order impact potentially that could happen.
Yeah.
And that again translates to health related issues and so on and so forth. So there are multiple things that can happen. So which is why, you need to be able to look at the system at large rather than looking at a singular problem of climate change itself. Yes, climate change is happening, but then food production, temperature is just one way. But the other way it could also impact is, pollinators. Bee populations could go down because of habitat destruction, which is a man-made problem. And then there is changes in rainfall patterns or, other things. Now, rainfall pattern also leads to change in a vegetation composition in a region, in a forested region. So it's kind of come together and then, it's a web at the end of the day. So all these interconnections matter.
Wow, this has really opened up my mind, especially this first order, second order, and third order. And it's a great way of explaining it to masses that this is the chronological impact that's actually going to come down to us. So thank you for that. Honestly, that was really, really insightful. Let's talk about the wetlands of Bengaluru. So do you believe that it is possible for us to reclaim them?
I would think, yes, not all of them, but a few of them at least, because there have been quite some instances of, groups which have actually successfully worked very closely with people who reside close to some of the lakes of Bangalore, or the wetlands as they call, and kind of rejuvenated them and then reclaimed some of them. So I wouldn't say all can be reclaimed, but to some extent, at least some of them definitely, there are success stories and there are models which can be followed, and I'm sure some of it could definitely be recovered.
One more follow-up question I would have is that what are the possible solutions to this in the future? I know we've discussed about it, but just considering Bengaluru, and how do we ensure this kind of episodes just don't happen again?
Right. So like I said, I think it's about communications. I would like to kind of stress more on that, but I think having good scientific information in itself is not sufficient. The information has to trickle down to the last person who is there. So which is very, very important. Now, that said, again, the information has to be in a form that people can make sense of, rather than, because generally the scientific audience we are used to kind of producing information in a certain form, but that does not lend itself for any the general public to make sense of. So how do you translate it? I think the ICAR program, that's the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, and the agricultural universities, they've done some good job around translating some of the climate information into decision-making kind of systems, which is the advisories that go out on a regular basis. So now these advisories are about, when it is going to rain, after how many hours or how many days, which is through the Krishi Vigyan Kendras or the KVKs. These are disseminated to the farmers. So now either through pamphlets or through SMS blasts and so on and so forth. So yes, there are certain people do subscribe to these, but then they should also be in a position to open and make sense out of it. Now, that would happen only when you sensitize even those people who are the users. You also build their capacity to decipher what comes to them in whatever form that makes sense to them. So I think it's a twofold approach that needs to be there. One, getting the information into a form which can be consumed by various different stakeholders. The other is to do with sensitizing and building awareness in people to use that information and then take the right decisions. So if this is done, then probably, we would be in a better space than where we are today. At the city level, the ULBs also are trying to develop a city level state climate action plans. Now, the city level climate action plans are very, very important because that would be very specific to a city. So if they kind of successfully develop that, that should also be developed in a consultative manner so that all the sections of the society are, have a voice, have a place. Because as we see in the climate change problem, the ones who are most vulnerable are the ones who are the weaker sections of the society. So now, given that they do not have the resources, when I say resources, it's not necessarily just financial resources. It's also about access to information. It's also about access to infrastructure. It's about access to whatever government programs, policies, or aid that comes in. So now those are very, very important to kind of bring into the action plan. How do you make the voices heard? How do you make everybody who is part of the urban system? They might be migrants, but still they are very important for the city level architecture, for the city to function the way it is. So how can we kind of make it a very inclusive one, an intersectional lens that we can apply into this? If we can successfully do that, I think then probably cities like Bangalore can definitely do much better than where we are today. So yes, I would think this is the only way to go forward. It can't happen overnight. It has to be in a phased manner. But I think the beginning, a start to this in itself would be great news.
Honestly, that's such a different point of view that you've given. Like usually, like you talk to people who are in this like scientific region and like doing research, they'll always like suggest concretize like something like that. Oh, we should go and talk to the government. I really like that you mentioned how we should go to each and every person and to the people who are the main stakeholders are in the poorer section of the society, which mostly people don't talk about. So that's a great point. And yeah, I think like this is very new to me because especially you coming from a science perspective, talking about communication, that sort of makes you realize how important that is as well. So that's a
because
really
at C-STEP, we kind of lay a lot of emphasis on the communications part of it. Being a policy think tank, for us, communication is not just one way. It's not necessarily only with the government. So it is also about translating this information or passing on the information that we do kind of generate to maybe industry stakeholders, people in the ecosystem, other civil society organizations who are working on the ground, right? So that's also important for us. So which is why, communication plays a very important part of all the work that we do here at SaciWATERs, probably, which is why, that kind of comes to the fore when I speak as well.
Yeah, that's incredible.
The important thing that we need to keep in mind is, yes, see, all said and done, yes, I did talk about everybody being part of the process, but ultimately, it's the government's prerogative. They have to kind of put in place the right policies, which kind of transcends to implementation on the ground. So the government will have to do its bit. All I'm saying is that even when the government is planning, can we kind of apply these principles that need to be there to make sure that we have a climate action plan which is not gender blind, which is not blind to various certain sections of the society. So I think if we can kind of make sure that happens, then probably yes, we would kind of definitely be buffering a lot of the damages that we incur year after year.
Yeah. Well, hope for that. But coming to our last question for today, and it has been an incredible discussion. And I'm not the kind of host that usually says that, but it has been really insightful for me. So,
thank you.
Yeah. So, coming to our last question, what would be your message to the people of Bengaluru? Because as this last recent episode of flooding has been quite a shocker, and it has reduced public trust in the city. So, what would be your message to them?
I would say that, it's easy to play the blame game, but I think each and every one of us have a responsibility. So mindful consumption, mindful use of resources, mindfully doing things that we do is also very essential in climate action. So behavioral change is a very important lever or a component when we talk about addressing the climate problem. Now,
Mhm.
that is something each of us as individuals can do. It's not about, how what difference is it going to make by me doing the change, but I think when each of us start doing that change, we don't realize that you're demonstrating it by doing that. Your people around you, there are so many people watching us even without us knowing, the people who are looking up to us, so
Mhm.
they would also bring about that change, which kind of transcends to a movement at the end of the day. So each of us have that power to bring about that change. Yes, governments need to do, which means it's again about conscious responsible voting,
Mhm.
which every one of us talk about. But then let's also remember that you and I also can be the change makers. So let's
Mhm.
do our bit before we start asking for bigger things.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this insightful discussion, Dr. Indu. And honestly, it's been quite an eye opener for me, and I learned a lot. Especially, I can't emphasize the way you explained the entire chronological process of climate change and its impact. That was, I think, very key for me to really understand how we can actually bring this issue to the masses. So, thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Parth. Thanks for this opportunity. I really enjoyed interacting with you. Looking forward to seeing more of your episodes and, of course, seeing
Definitely.
my own too. Yeah. Let me know
Yeah,
whenever it's up and going. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you.